to walk you through some of the extraordinary texts that NBC has been digging through, delivered by the former U.S. envoy to Ukraine, Volker, to House lawmakers. These texts speak directly to the issue at the heart of the impeachment inquiry, whether President Trump was using the prestige and the financial power of the United States as leverage to force the president of Ukraine to help him investigate a political rival. I'm talking Joe Biden. I want to walk you through this step by step. The first text I'm going to read is from the morning of July 25th. That is the very day of the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. The text is from the envoy, Volker, to Zelensky's aide, Andrei Yermak, appearing to lay out the President of the United States' expectations for that call. Volker says this: heard from the White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate and get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down a date for a visit to Washington. Afterward, Yermak tells Volker the call went well and President Trump offered some dates for a White House meeting. But then 2 weeks after that, Yermak tells Volker he wants the visit to be made official before committing to any investigation. He also mentions Burisma and election meddling specifically. At that point, it seems like things are on track until August 28th, when Politico reports that the White House has been keeping military aid on hold for months. It is pretty clear Yermak and the Ukrainians were taken by surprise, because he actually texts the article to Volker and says they need to talk. 2 days later, the State Department officials were told President Trump had canceled plans to meet with Zelensky. On September 1st, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, texts the U.S. ambassador to EU, Gordon Sondland, and writes this: are we now saying that security assistance and White House meetings are conditioned on investigations? Sondland says, call me. 8 days later, Taylor brings up this issue again, writing, as I said on the phone, I think it is crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. But this time, Sondland pushes back, writing, Bill, I believe you are incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear. No quid pro quos of any kind. Then Sondland says, we should stop texting about this. We have a lot to get into. We're going to dig deeper with Josh Lederman, NBC's national political reporter. He has been looking through all of this. Josh, Politico is calling these texts smoking texts. You tell us what stands out to you.
Two big takeaways from these texts that we got late last night, Stephanie. We've been pouring through them all night. First of all, this was not just an operation that was limited to Rudy Giuliani freelancing. It's clear from these texts that senior U.S. diplomats were proactively working to advance the president's goal of getting the Ukrainians to agree to launch this investigation into the Bidens and the president's other political opponents. Second of all, we now know that these ambassadors were working together not only with Rudy Giuliani, but also with the Ukrainian aide to the president there to try to make sure that they actually had specific language that they wanted to come out of the Ukrainian president's mouth when he would make a statement vowing to pursue this investigation.
This is amazing. I need some experts to weigh in on this and explain exactly what we're seeing. Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. Tom Nichols, national security expert and columnist with USA Today. Christopher Dickey, world news editor for the Daily Beast. He joins us from Paris. And our own Keir Simmons here with us in New York. Keir, President of the United States is trying to explain this away. But these texts, I watched Andrew McCabe on TV last night. Yeah. And he said he's investigated these things for years. You almost never see a quid pro quo on a phone call so clearly as do this and I'll give you that. Right. Politico calling these the smoking texts. Yeah. Does the president really have wiggle room now that we've read these?
Look, I tell you something, my kind of bird's eye view of all of this is we should stop texting about this. Oh, you think? I mean, what kind of political amateurs are writing this stuff down and writing phone calls? I mean, you remember this week that I questioned President Putin, and one of the interesting things that President Putin said was, with my background, by which he means my background in the KGB, I know that you don't say anything in phone calls that you don't want to be made public. I mean, look, let's be real. This is not the first time that American politicians have been trying to get involved in politics in the rest of the world, and it always has an influence on what happens in Washington. You remember Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs for the US, that phone conversation she had with the US ambassador in Ukraine, in which they talked about who should be in the Ukrainian government back in 2014. Again, why do you do it on a phone call? It gets leaked. So fundamentally, don't write in text or say on phone calls things that you might be, concerned about if they're made public, and then you get to the question of what they actually said and what they were actually up to.
All right, that gets to a bit of a duh, I can't believe you're texting.
Right.
Or can we? Thomas Wright, is this how diplomacy is now conducted, via text message?
Well, it's less, I think, the text messages themselves and the message of them that's incredibly, disturbing. I mean, what these texts reveal, as you said, is that this was not just a rogue operation from Giuliani that the State Department was trying to frustrate or stop. They were actually working with Giuliani to put pressure on the Ukrainians. And I think that's basically unprecedented. And the only ones who really come out with any credibility out of this are, the Ukrainians, who actually resist this throughout. And there are various moments in the text messages where the U.S. diplomats say that Ukraine's not on board with this. So it's really the height of irony that we're, concerned about corruption in Ukraine, but it's actually the Ukraine government that was pushing back to some extent on what the State Department and the White House is trying to do.
Chris, what stuck out to you about these exchanges? It's not uncommon for the United States to use their leverage, but this is leverage with a specific political agenda against most likely the president's clearest political foe in the upcoming election.
Well, I think we have to think about what this leverage is, too. Ukraine is a country at war. It's at war with Russia through its proxy forces in eastern Ukraine, and that's what it needs the aid for. It's not just sort of wants foreign aid because that would be a nice thing. It needs that aid to survive. So this is real leverage, and the pressure that was being put on Ukraine was really extreme. I think there's also something that's being missed in this discussion of the texts, and that is who is texting back and forth. We're talking about two professional diplomats, Volker and Taylor, and then we're talking about a political appointee, Sondland. He's the guy who's trying to drive this train. Is he a diplomat? No. His title is ambassador to the European Union, but the fact is he's a hotel owner and a huge contributor to Donald Trump's campaign. That's who Mr. Sondland is, and he's the one who says, let's get off the text messages, because he's the one who's trying to drive this train. The others are professionals who are just trying to navigate an impossible situation.
Tom Nichols, it has been an extraordinary 48 hours. Last night, as these text messages became public, I watched former Ambassador Michael McFaul on the 11th hour. I've never seen him, I would say, so worked up or so rattled or so shocked. And I want to share what he said about these specific diplomats involved.
These diplomats, and they're both political appointees, by the way. The EU ambassador, he is a Trump supporter. He's not a professional diplomat. They're not career diplomats. Ambassador Volker, who I know well, was also a political appointee in this job. They are working with Giuliani. They are working this. They are part of what is going on here. And I think so far, let's see what we learn, but in these texts today, the real hero is the acting ambassador, Bill Taylor, a person who I know well in Ukraine, who says in these texts, if we are going to do a quid pro quo, security assistance, military assistance for a political favor for the president, I'm not part of that. And he says, I quit. That's what everybody should have said when they heard about this crazy scheme.
It wasn't just the ambassador to the EU. Let's remind everyone, Rudy Giuliani, a private citizen, is directly involved in contacts with the president of Ukraine regarding what the United States wanted Zelensky to say publicly. Tom Nichols, A, what should we make of that? And B, does anyone here yet know who is paying Rudy Giuliani. Tom, to you first.
There's a couple of things to think about here. First of all, the texts are really amazing examples of amateur hour. And Sondland saying, well, we need to understand the president and then get off Twitter is like when Nixon was talking about payoffs, but he knew he was recording himself, and he leans in and says, but it would be wrong. Just to make sure that was captured somewhere in the record. But everybody knew what they were doing, and these texts are very clear that they know what they're doing and that they know what they're doing is wrong. This is government by amateur and amateur cronies. The other worry I have here that's getting lost in all of this is whether there was an explicit quid pro quo. That doesn't really matter. The president is already well into impeachment territory by elevating his personal political interests above the national interests of the United States, using Rudy Giuliani. And I'm sure that most foreign leaders, when they encounter Giuliani, have an immediate question of why the hell am I talking to Rudy Giuliani at all? Who is clearly being sent to send the message that the president, on a personal level, wants this thing. He wants this pressure against his political opponents. Whether there's ever if you do this, I will do that, I think the quid pro quos are clear. But let's not lose sight of the fact that the real offense here, the offense against the Constitution, the offense against the office of the presidency, is the exercise of political power for personal gain, and to mortgage the national security interests of the United States in a case that involves our most dedicated enemy and potentially a situation that could erupt into World War III in the middle of Europe simply because Donald Trump wants to get dirt on one of his political opponents.
Chris, there's a difference between amateur hour and known wrongdoing. The President of the United States has insisted that this had nothing to do with withholding military aid. But on these text messages, Bill Taylor at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine apparently thinks it does. He brings it up twice, on September 1st and then again on September 9th. What does that tell you? Chris?
Well, he knows damn well it has everything to do with the issue. He knows very well that it has everything to do with the issues that we're discussing. He doesn't want to do it. And he says, at least for a moment in the text, that he would quit if he wound up having to do that. But I think there's a risk here that we're going to get sidetracked talking about these functionaries at much lower levels and lose sight of the fact that it's the president driving this train. He's the one who's behind all this. They're trying to satisfy the president of the United States. He's going to say at some point, I'm sure, that's them, that's not me. Maybe they thought it was a quid pro quo. I didn't say it was a quid pro quo. That's going to be his game. I think we need to focus on the president of the United States.
Okay, well, that is the game that mobsters work. I didn't do the shooting. It was the hitman. But let's take you, Thomas, Wright, to, what was it, 2 weeks ago at the UNGA when President Trump and the president of Ukraine were side by side in a press conference. Let's take a look at that.
I want to thank you for invitation to Washington. Right. You invited me, but I think I'm sorry, but I think you forgot to tell me the date. But I think in the nearest future.
They'll tell you the date.
Oh, yes, they know before us.
It's been such a crazy week. It was actually last week, not 2 weeks ago. So there, right there, Zelensky, that was the first or second thing he said at the UNGA, sitting next to the president. So this meeting between the two of them has been hanging over, hasn't it, Thomas?
Yes, I think very much so. I mean, the president of Ukraine, I think, needed that meeting, and that's why the administration had leverage over him. I also wanted to highlight, though, one aspect of this, which is Gordon Sondland, who's been mentioned in this conversation already. I mean, it's really extraordinary that he was involved. He's ambassador to the European Union. Ukraine is not in the European Union. Why was he involved in this? I think the answer is very clear. He is a trusted confidant and supporter and funder of Donald Trump. So he is the person that Trump and Giuliani placed into the middle of this to ensure it went according to their wishes. And I think he has some very, very serious questions to answer on this matter. And it seems unsustainable that he will continue in his role as ambassador to the EU now that these messages have come out.
Keir, I want to play what Mike Pence said during a vice presidential debate back in 2016. Listen to this.
Now, y'all need to know out there, this is basic stuff. Foreign donors and certainly foreign governments cannot participate in the American.
All need to know out there that this is basic stuff. So is the argument that investigating Joe Biden would have no influence at all on the 2020 election, that the two things aren't connected? Come on now. Yeah, I believe you led this segment with duh. I'm going to hit you back with a duh.
Yeah, I mean, look, clearly, it's just nonsense, right? I mean, you know, another thing that we're forgetting, though, and it's heartbreaking.
There's so much, it's easy to forget.
Yeah. I mean, look, but listen, it's heartbreaking to just think about the effect on American diplomacy, effect on America's position around the world. Just think about what are governments around the world thinking right now? What is Beijing thinking, knowing that it has negotiations with the White House over trade, and at the same time watching President Trump stand up and say, hey, China, investigate the Bidens for me? How do they move forward? It's tough for America's friends around the world and for America's enemies. I mean, I suppose the best thing that you can say is that the enemies are destabilized.
All right, then. We're talking friends and enemies around the world. I want to end, Tom Nichols, on Ukraine. We learned overnight that Ukraine is conducting an audit into cases handled by the previous prosecutor general. That includes cases relating to the gas company that Hunter Biden worked for. Of course, we know there has been no evidence of wrongdoing by Joe or Hunter Biden. What do you make of how the Ukraine is handling this?
The Ukrainians are in a terribly difficult situation because they have a president of the United States who wants them to do his personal political bidding. Now, looking back at the previous prosecutor and his cases, that's perfectly normal. I think that's their internal matter. But again, and I agree with the other folks here have pointed out, we really can't get too fixated on what happened here, because that's really not relevant to Donald Trump's conduct. The fact of the matter is the president is putting, in this case, a weaker power and a friend, not a formal ally, in a very tight spot to say, we realize you're at war with our most dangerous enemy, and if you want to be on our good side, you're going to have to help the president out with his personal political matters. But in the time it took us to talk about that, the president went out on the South Lawn and called on an authoritarian giant, also at best a frenemy, in China, and did the same thing. I mean, this is a pattern of behavior by the president of the United States. You have to feel for the Ukrainians here, but I think that their hope is to just keep their head low. Like a lot of countries in Europe, they're going to have to start thinking about making their own deals with the Russians, which I think is going to be terrible for the United States. But again, Donald Trump has elevated his personal interests over the national interest, and so it's not surprising that the Ukrainians are going to at least try to placate him somewhat. But that to me is secondary to the president's behavior overall.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.